Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Editor-in-Chief Jeff Palais. Thanks for being with us today. I'm joined by policy staff writer Annalise Reinwald, who's here to help me announce an exciting new tool we recently rolled out here at Ballotpedia, the Administrative State Legislation Tracker. Annalise, thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I always like to ask people this when they come work at Ballotpedia or when they come on the show sometimes, but tell me about your Meet Ballotpedia story, because everyone has a different story of how they came across Ballotpedia. Mine was in 2010. I was not aware of Ballotpedia, and then I became aware of Ballotpedia. But most people today actually know us, which is very exciting for us. We love that 1 and 2 voters come to Ballotpedia before voting. But tell me about your story. How did you meet Ballotpedia before coming to work here?
Yeah, so when I was voting for the first time in 2018, I had no idea who was on my ballot. And so I figured before voting, I would try to know a little bit more. So I ran across Ballotpedia that way. I majored in journalism in school. So doing a lot of political reporting, I would refer back to Ballotpedia over and over. I got a little bit more into the education realm. I figured that journalism and education were two sides of the same coin. And I wanted to be a teacher for a long time. So I ended up teaching preschool after I graduated for a little bit. And then I decided I wanted to get back into writing. And I found that Ballotpedia was hiring for a policy staff writer, and it felt like it struck the perfect niche for what I wanted to do. So applied, and here I am, and I'm very thrilled to be working on the policy team. I love the fact that I learn a new thing every single day.
Yeah. Well, if you were here in Charleston, my daughter probably would have kept you as a preschool teacher because she's that exciting. Or she would have scheduled you off earlier. I'm not really sure. So anyway, well, I love that. I'm glad we were able to help you out. You're one of the many millions using the sample ballot lookup tool, which I use myself as well. So, let's talk about the administrative state, which is a really mouthful of words. So tell our listeners about the Administrative State Project and our coverage at Ballotpedia. We've been doing our articles on it for quite a long time now. So what is the administrative state, and what kind of content do we have in our project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm just going to start off by defining the administrative state. So Ballotpedia defines the administrative state as the phenomenon where executive branch administrative agencies exercise the power to create, adjudicate, and enforce their own rules. For example, the EPA may issue rules to implement the Clean Air Act of 2020 as enacted by our federal Congress. So Ballotpedia actually started tracking the administrative state in 2017, and it predated the policy department, which is something that I recently learned. I'm newer to Ballotpedia, so I'm still learning all this, but
I'll tell you all the war stories one day. Keep going.
Perfect. But Ballotpedia tracks 5 main pillars of the administrative state, which I won't get into right now because I'd keep everyone on the horn for a couple hours if I did. But I encourage listeners to check out our administrative state page on Ballotpedia's website, which hopefully will be linked in the show notes. But yeah, we have a rather large taxonomy related to the administrative state. We track reform. We have tracked stuff like the Federal Register that pumps out new rules from agencies. We track the Congressional Review Act, which tracks legislation that aims to repeal agency rules. Again, I encourage readers to go check out our administrative state index for more information on this. But
how many articles do we have in our administrative state index? I know it grows every day, but it's grown quite substantially over the years.
You know, Jeff, I actually don't know the answer to that question. I could find out for you.
We can look it up in the show and we'll edit it out and put it in.
Okay, okay, perfect. Here, I'm going to go.
Yeah.
Right now.
But yeah, I always say that because it's grown to be one of the really large policy areas that we have because it's such a complicated subject area. And while you're looking that up, tell our listeners a little bit about what do we mean by taxonomy, because it doesn't mean taxidermy. It doesn't have anything to do with hunting. But what is taxonomy when we use it internally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that just means all of the content that we have relating to the administrative state. So we've got articles, we have like scholarly information from like conglomerated from different sources. We talk about arguments related to reform. We talk about, or I guess we just have updates from several different agencies, federally and state agencies. We have like data surveys of how administrative agency policy works in different states. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Okay, great.
So, okay. So we've had this administrative state project for a really long time now at Ballotpedia. I'm sure you're about to tell me exactly how many articles we have on Ballotpedia, or at least close to it. And what we then got to do most recently was launch a new product offering for this coverage area, and that's the legislation tracker. So, tell me a little bit about, tell us where did the idea come from to do legislation tracking, and why is that an important part of the administrative state as a policy area?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ballotpedia noticed that there was an information gap in reform activity surrounding the administrative state at a state level. And Jeff, as you know, Ballotpedia is big on reporting on the state and local levels.
Yep.
Federally is important as well, but we figured that we would create this one-stop shop for being able to see what our legislation tracking as or in regards to the administrative state. So what we did was we already had reform proposals, just a taxonomy or information about like reform proposals on our website, and we used those to single out keywords that could be in bills and in the text of legislation that we're looking for. And we use a software called BillTrack 50. And so we entered these keywords into BillTrack 50, and it pulled in a ton of bills. We sorted through around 2,500 bills at the start of it. We read the text for them to see if they related to the type of legislation we were trying to track. And so then after we sorted through all of them, we imported them into our state legislation table, which is reader facing. That's what the reader sees whenever they go to our bill tracker.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've worked very closely and intimately with our elections legislation tracker, which if any recurring listeners on the show know, I've come on the show to talk about that product of ours. And, it's a similar process, but what's really interesting with this new tracker we have is, it's the first of its kind. There really isn't anything else out there covering the administrative state at the state legislative level. And administrative state legislation is really nuanced and varied. I mean, it touches almost every type of bill out there. It's a lot more nuanced to track than, say, I'm looking to cover elections legislation related to absentee ballot voting. Okay, well, you can look for that. And there are, a lot of tools out there that also provide that kind of coverage. So in this new product area, it's really fun because this is the first of its kind that's out there. So we're really able to provide a sort of groundbreaking coverage area. So tell me a little what's something that's interesting. So you got in there 2,500 bills. What are some of the really interesting things that we discovered once we started getting into the legislation?
Yeah, that is a great question. I am super interested to see that the administrative state covers a lot of different areas of governmental and public life, because the administrative state is very broad. So that encompasses many different state agencies in different arenas. So we had to do a lot of group calls to see, is this reform related? Is this reform related? You'll see on our tracker that we have different topics that all of the bills are categorized into. So it's surprising to see that the bills we were looking for that reform the administrative state, they're from all different portions of the government and portions of I guess, public life.
Mm-hmm.
So that was surprising. We're also surprised to see that it is like the reform that we're tracking, it expands and contracts the administrative state in both Republican and Democratic states. So what we're seeing is okay, I'm going to give an example. So
Yeah.
We are tracking in terms of categories. We have, I think we have somewhere around 12 to 15 different categories. Specifically, we're tracking delegation, which refers to the phenomenon where legislation delegates tools to administrative agencies. And by tools, I mean authority to promulgate rules. And so we saw, in terms of bills relating to delegation, we saw Iowa contract some delegation authority from the administrative agencies, and then we saw Illinois expanding delegation.
Right.
So what we're seeing is sort of all over the place is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, and that's really the beauty of the tools that we have, and the way the legislation tracker works is it allows a user to see what are the kinds of reforms that are being introduced and then enacted in the different states by different parties, by different topic areas. And it's a really interactive tool to get into that. There are so many different search queries you could do off of different states you want, different topics, the trifecta status of the state governments. And it allows readers to really stay on top of all that. Otherwise, it just becomes kind of a cloudy mess. I mean, there's 170,000 introduced bills in state legislatures every year. There are 585,000 elected officials in the country. There's a lot of government out there, and there's a lot to keep up with. So the advocacy tracker tool in particular is really exciting because, again, it's allowing us to draw connections between the different activities in different states. So how can readers find out more about how do they use the tool? How can they find out about the sort of themes and observations that we're making using the tracker ourselves?
Absolutely. So if they're looking for themes from the tracker, we have a section called Overview Data where we provide information like admin state related bills, bipartisan affiliation of sponsors. We also provide information about where most legislation is introduced regarding the administrative state reform, which is in New York and Minnesota, by the way. And Idaho actually has the most enacted bills, which I found extremely interesting. But you can also, if you're approaching this tracker with a specific question about your state, you can search bills by your state. If you're approaching the tracker trying to research about a specific reform area, you can search by topic. If you're searching for enacted bills in your state, you can filter for your state legislation or for your state legislative status and your trifecta status as well. If you're just curious about the tracker tool in general, there's just a lot of ways that you can search the information that we share. So once you find a bill you're interested in, you can click on it and find information about the bill status, partisanship related to the bill, sponsors, most recent action, and finally a bill summary.
Yeah, I mean, it's we're recording this the week of after Memorial Day, and there were 86 bills enacted as of now, and this is just our first year collecting this information. So what are we expecting is to come in the 2025 session? Obviously, the election in November will be a pretty big factor in what happens in state legislative sessions next year. But holding that all aside, what is the administrative state team seeing as some trends? What are they looking for that we might need to be on the lookout for next year in terms of the legislative activity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned before, delegation and non-delegation is a hot topic, and we're likely to see more momentum in that area. Deference or judicial deference, which refers to the ability of judges who are adjudicating cases against agency regarding their authority or contesting any rules made. We're likely to see momentum in that area as well, especially with the Supreme Court case called Loper Bright that should have a decision coming out soon.
Right. So let's hang around on that for a second. So one of the things that we've seen in state legislative sessions a lot in the last couple of years are responses and reactions to Supreme Court rulings. And this goes back, forever and ever. One branch of the government acts, the next branch reacts. So, for instance, to go back almost a decade, in the Janus court case, Supreme Court laid out a decision that hit with respect to public sector unions. And in the years after that, states all across the country regularly passed legislation reacting to that. The most recent example that's probably most commonly known is with the Dobbs decision around abortion. And since that decision, states left and right have been passing legislation one way or the other. Have we seen any legislation, Annalise, about Chevron deference either this year, or do we think we're going to see some next year, depending on how the Supreme Court rules?
Yes, Jeff, we've seen a lot of bills coming through our tracker related to deference and both expanding it and contracting it at the state level. If readers are interested in seeing what that is, you can go to the Admin State Tracker and search for bills that are tagged as judicial deference. But yes, we have seen stuff coming through this year, and we are expecting to see more next year.
Yeah, really interesting.
Sorry, back to what you were saying earlier, there are a lot of, or another example of federal activity coming down to the state level is the REINS Act is something that was enacted federally, and that stands for Regulations from Executives in Need of Scrutiny. And that essentially requires legislative approval of rules that would have an economic effect above a certain monetary threshold. And so we saw that bill has not passed federal Congress. It passed the House, but it's still in the Senate. But we have seen a lot of REINS style bills in the state level as well. And we expect to see that ramping up in 2025, as well as continuing in this session.
That's right. And there hasn't been a state that has already enacted a REINS bill. Is that right?
Yes, we have Florida and Wisconsin have REINS style legislation enacted.
Got it. Really interesting. How else can readers or listeners follow along with our content related to the administrative state? So we've got the tracker, we've got articles on Ballotpedia. How else can they follow along with our work?
Yeah, we have a newsletter called Checks and Balances that is monthly. Highly recommend readers and listeners to subscribe. That one is a little bit more in depth, has a lot of contextualization. Jeff, like you said earlier, it's a very nuanced situation with a lot of different opinions, and Checks and Balances is a really good resource. We're also hoping to put out more reports on the tracker as we get further into the data. It's still very new, having just been rolled out earlier this month. And so once we have a better handle on the data and we see more information, trends, themes, we're going to be pulling those out through Checks and Balances as well. We have a map component coming to the tracker later this year, which is really exciting. So yeah.
I've been looking forward to that for a long time, so I'm really excited for that one. Well, great. Thanks so much, Annalise, for coming on the show today. And I look forward to poking around the tracker myself and see what kind of bills are to come as we head into the end of sessions next month, and we'll get ready for next year. So great to have you on the show today, Annalise. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It was great to be here.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Paulet. Thanks for listening.